This is a wide-ranging report, 250 pages, as I counted them, and it covers things like pharmaceuticals and batteries and rare earths. I want to focus on one, though, in particular, and that's semiconductors, because there's a fair amount in here on semiconductors. One of the things you recommend is appropriation of $50 billion to invest in production of semiconductors, build those plants. How'd you come up with that number? How do we know that's enough or not too much?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this critically important report, and I'll get to your semiconductor question, which of course is of such core importance to the economy and the auto industry in particular. This is a report, though, that explains the pathway to a much more resilient and a much less fragile global supply chain serving the U.S. economy. We're talking about bringing back advanced manufacturing, making a strong play for a global share in large capacity batteries, diversifying access to critical inputs, and of course one of those has to be semiconductors. In terms of the $50 billion investment, this is a deep and consequential magnitude of an investment in producing semiconductors and subsidizing the building of semiconductor plants, the financing. In terms of where it comes from, it's related to the CHIPS Act, which is something that the Senate has been talking about, or some variation of that recently. And my understanding is that has pretty significant bipartisan support. So I think it's gratifying to me to hear that politicians of both sides of the aisle that often have trouble coming together on important issues like this are doing so when it comes to meeting and facing and pushing back on these supply chain constraints.
It did strike me in reading it that it probably is not a coincidence that, as I understand it, that bill that's pending right now, the Senate's supposed to vote on maybe today, is $52 billion, just about your $50 billion number. It looks like that's going to go through with bipartisan support, as you say, on the Senate side. But on the House side, it's much more trouble. Are you going to have trouble with the Democrats getting this done?
Well, as an economist here, I have the privilege of not having to do these kinds of nose counts. What I can tell you is that Representative DeFazio has been out front on many of these infrastructure issues, pulling out parts of the jobs plan, the president's jobs plan, that are very much in sync with what's coming over from the Senate. So while I can't speak to this vote or that vote, certainly I believe that the sentiment has real momentum there, again, coming over from a bipartisan thrust in the Senate. But I also have to talk a little bit about the preferences of the American people. Whether they're D's or R's, people are consistently telling pollsters, I mean numbers that go way north of 50%, that they want to see these kinds of investments made in American infrastructure. Why? Not because they're tracking, semiconductors or R&D as a share of GDP, but they recognize that to be competitive in this global economy, we cannot depend on fragile supply chains that served us poorly when the pandemic hit. So here we have the President of the United States and the Senate, as we discussed today, responding in a way that I haven't seen government respond before to this economic constraint that has been in place for a long time with inadequate government response.
So fair enough on the politics point. So let's talk about, as an economist, again, let's assume you get the $50 billion. What will it buy and when will it be up and running? Because as you know, a lot of U.S. industry right now needs those semiconductors yesterday.
Okay, so this is dedicated funding for semiconductor manufacturing and for R&D. It takes a couple of years to stand up a semiconductor fab. I think probably listeners to this station know that. However, that's not the only initiative that was announced today. The other initiative that was announced, similar to this one, was much more of a near-term set of initiatives, one led by the Secretaries of Commerce, Agriculture, and Transportation in the areas of home building, construction, lumber, semiconductors, transportation, and food. And therein, I believe you'll start hearing comments from that task force in ways to try to alleviate some of these bottlenecks in the near term. It takes about 100 semiconductors to build a car these days, I'm told. And if you saw these articles with President Biden out today, you saw him holding a semiconductor. My first thought was, hey, let's put that back in a car. So certainly the urgency is one that we feel strongly here in the White House.
Will that task force be essentially doing triage? Because to date, thus far as I understand it, the White House has been reluctant to say, okay, the semiconductors we have go to that industry rather than that one. And if it isn't triage, then what can they really do to address the bottlenecks?
Well, one of the things they can do is they can get together with the folks who have ground level information on these bottlenecks and these constraints. And by the way, not just in semiconductors, but in all kinds of logistics. I had a great conversation the other day with someone who was really educating me on the containers that go on container ships and the kind of logistical headaches that we've had in that regard. Just on every link of the supply chain, there are experts out there with whom this task force will be closely consulting. Some of those meetings will be public, by the way. And so there will be more information forthcoming on precise measures that this more near-term initiative will be taking, as I said, in weeks, not months.
So let's take a look at the longer term, if we could. I mean, if you were running a company, you'd be saying we don't have a problem just now. We've got to think about where we're going to be in 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years. Right. We've seen a huge demand for semiconductors, in part because of the pandemic. But let's be honest, the entire economy is moving, whether it's electric vehicles or so many other uses of semiconductors. What will this $50 billion do in terms of what are needed in the out years? What are you projecting in terms of semiconductor need and fulfilling that 5 years from now, 7 years from now?
Well, I think that the thrust of the report is that this is not a one-time temporary initiative to just kind of look at supply chains, say what we know, and get out of the way. What we're trying to do here is a deep set of information gathering so that we identify every tangible constraint in the supply chains, areas where we think markets can make a difference, and areas where government needs to take a role. As far as semiconductors is concerned, you know, it is no, I'm sure you know this and your viewers, it is no accident that Korea and Taiwan are major producers of semiconductors. And it's also no accident that when that narrow, kind of just-in-time supply chain took a hit, we got into the kind of problems that we're talking about today, particularly in autos. So we're talking about long-term portfolio investments in trying to dedicate funding for semiconductor manufacturing. Now, some of that's going to take place in the near term, and we have to observe how our investments play out. Obviously, you don't want to try to fix a problem 5 years away if that problem isn't existing. You don't know what its depth is going to look like. But in the near term, we know we have to do something about helping autos get the inputs they need. And in the medium term, that $50 billion investment, both coming from the White House and from the Senate side right now, at least in terms of the negotiations I'm hearing about, that's a strong medium-term play for standing up semiconductor domestic capacity.
So, Jared, you mentioned Korea, which really is a leader, as you say, in this area, along with Taiwan. I wonder, reading this report, I don't want to say it's depending on the kindness of strangers, but the kindness of allies, because one of the things in here is $17 billion has been announced by Korean companies investing in the United States. Is that part of the strategy to get our allies to invest in facilities here in the United States to make semiconductors?
I would say that the key strategy here is to stand up a domestic part of the industry. By the way, the report is quite clear on this point. It says that we are not going to replace globalization with domestic production at 100%. We're going to make sure that our global portfolio is much less fragile, much more resilient, much wider, so that we're not dependent on a couple of links in the supply chain. But when we talk about standing up production here, some of that's going to be domestic, some of that's going to be from other companies. The key thing there, by the way, is the quality of the jobs, which is something that this president never forgets about. So if you're going to build a factory here, the goal in this report is to make sure that the workers who fill that factory are adequately trained, that they have the skills, and that they're remunerated commensurately with what they're bringing to the table. That means union jobs in many cases. It certainly means a fair level of pay and compensation. So that's another side of this puzzle that's extremely important to this president.
And one more piece of the puzzle that's identified in this report, and that is trade. For example, you have some tariffs maybe to impose on some magnets that, frankly, I'm not that familiar with, but are critical in some of the electric motors. What is the role of trade in here? Do we need to really be regulating what is coming into the country in order to protect our supply chains?
Well, I think the most important innovation there in the report is setting up what's something called the Trade Strike Task Force, which, by the way, the Council of Economic Advisors, of which I'm a member, is on that task force. And the idea there is to have a group within our administration, of course, working closely with USTR, to monitor trade practices and to hit back hard when those practices are unfair. Some of that might be dumping, some of that might be currency management, but the point is to make sure that the playing field in terms of international competition is level, which isn't always the case, and have a task force whose job it is to watch for that. But at the same time, I think the key to the report that I've been stressing is to not be passive and, sort of sit back and watch other countries with whom we compete invest deeply in R&D, invest deeply in their supply chains, invest deeply in the kinds of rare earths and materials that you need for semiconductors or those that you need for pharmaceuticals, and just kick back and watch it happen and basically ignore the supply chain, landing where we've landed in a place where that supply chain isn't as sustainable and reliable as it needs to be. And in that regard, we're talking about policies that go, all the way from making sure workers are paid fairly for the kinds of jobs that this will create, to making sure that these supply chains are stood up with speed and efficiency.